I want to introduce myself, have my colleagues introduce themselves, and then any other staff members can unmute themselves if they want to and introduce themselves. My name is Samantha Lukashevitz. I'm a program officer at the Virginia Service Commission. I also do compliance, and I facilitate the RFA and grant making process at the commission.
Hi, I'm Shannon Gerard, and I'm the fiscal officer with the Virginia Service Commission.
Hi, everyone. My name is Annalise Adams, and I'm another one of the Americorps program officers, and my specialty area is evaluation and data collection.
Great, thank you guys. I see one or two other staff members on the call from the commission. Not sure if you guys want to unmute yourself and just introduce yourselves real quick.
I can do that, Sam. This is Christina Dumas. I'm a monitoring and compliance specialist at the commission. Welcome.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to get right into it. I did want to ask everyone to hold their questions until the end of the webinar. I know that that can be kind of difficult because you have a question as a slide comes up, but if you could wait to type your name or type your question in the chat until the end, so we make sure that we don't miss any of the questions. Or at the end, we have an opportunity where you can unmute yourself and just ask the question and we can have a discussion, etc. So let's go on to the first slide, if you could, Annalise. Okay, so our agenda for today's webinar is a brief overview of AmeriCorps 101. This is a secondary, I guess, part of our series. We had a few outreach webinars about AmeriCorps 101, all about AmeriCorps over the past 2 months. And this is more a guide to your program design, your organizational capacity, cost effectiveness, budget adequacy, what we're really looking for in terms of narrative and design when you are applying for our grants in Virginia. Excuse me. So I'm just going to have a brief overview of AmeriCorps. At the end, like I said, we're going to take questions at the end in the chat or by unmuting yourself. So get right into it. What is AmeriCorps? So it's a national service program that deploys individuals of all ages to address community needs. There's over 270,000 AmeriCorps members deployed at any one time. In Virginia, this came from the AmeriCorps website. You'll see that in the Commonwealth, we have over 3,000 individuals serving. So at 4 different service locations across the state. So this is AmeriCorps State and National, which is the program that the commission has and grants for. It includes AmeriCorps Vista and it includes AmeriCorps Seniors. At the commission, we have a couple different kinds of grants that we, I guess, grant out through an RFA process. We have operational grants, which are grants that are supporting member activities directly, and they're going to organizations that have a clear program design and already have the organizational capacity to deploy members at the start of a defined performance period. Planning grants do not support members, and instead there's a cap on the funds that we're going to provide for the planning process, which involves creating a sustainable program design, but not specifically for your organizational capacity. I mentioned the other webinars that we had over the past couple months. There is more about each of these different types of grants in those webinars, which are on our website, the Office of Volunteerism and Community Service website. And there's going to be a link for that in this PowerPoint, and we'll make sure to send out the slides at the end of the presentation or the day after. For those of you who are on the call and you're interested in a planning grant, we're not necessarily going to be specifically speaking to that application process. We're not talking about necessarily the ins and outs of the RFA, right, which has the operational instructions, which has the planning instructions. However, we are going to make some points that we're addressing things that are part of a successful program and things in your planning process that you're going to be required to address eventually when you apply for an operational grant. So all this information is important, and be listening with that kind of perspective. So before we go any further, in red, are you eligible to apply? If you're a for-profit, you're not going to be eligible. You can read these these small words a little bit later at your discretion. They are included in all the documents that we put out on our website and on the Americorps website. So if you're an Indian tribe, an institution of higher education, local government, nonprofit, you're going to be eligible to apply. You have to ask yourself, are you going to be using these federal funds that we're granting out to replace funds that you've lost because of X, Y, or Z? So we can't supplant any funds that you had previously used to fund a program. We also don't grant funds to displace employees or volunteers. So if you have either of those things and they go away for whatever reason, we can't just insert Americorps funding to replace that. So keep those things in mind before you even start your application, and ask yourself if these things do or don't apply to yourself. So when we release the RFA, and I'll get into that in a minute, but all this information about supplantation and non-displacement and eligibility is kept and housed within that document. A couple of things when you're writing your Americorps application, just as an introduction before we get into the meat of it. When the RFA comes out, please read it. That is the most important part. Like I said, we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty about what is included in an Americorps application. It's more higher level narrative information and budget information. But the documents that Americorps put on their website, the notice of funding opportunity and the application instructions is where we pull the information from to create our Virginia Service Commission RFA process. So please read it, and please read all the appendices. When the RFA is posted, which is usually late fall, early winter, so around this time of year, we can't answer questions directly. There is an optional pre-application conference, and all those instructions will be listed in the RFA. And that's where you can ask questions. We can have, specific conversations maybe about the instructions in the RFA, but any other questions has to go through our procurement process and our procurement officer. And then obviously we have more resources on our website. So I think I'm going to pass it over to Annalise. Yeah.
Great. We're excited you all are here. I'll just echo what Samantha said earlier. I think this presentation is going to be helpful on a lot of different levels, whether or not you have ever applied for Americorps before or you have an Americorps program. Hopefully this will just kind of help lay some groundwork. And again, if you are interested in applying for a planning grant, I still think this is really great information because it will really outline the process that you will be planning. So if you are specifically interested in planning grants for this next section about program design, I would really encourage thinking with that lens of what of these questions do I already know the answer to, and which of these questions am I going to have to make sure is a part of my planning process. So first, we're going to jump in with program design. When we talk about program design, there's a lot of different things that could mean, right? Folks throw around the phrase program design to mean a lot of different things. So when we talk about it in the Americorps context, we're really talking about kind of the holistic view of your program. So this is everything from the activities your members are doing, why they're doing them, the community impact, and how all of this comes together. So some things that your program design does is really just kind of helps give you a blueprint for what your program is doing and what your program is going to accomplish. This is really encouraging you to think about your program from start to finish before the program begins, which I come from a nonprofit background. I know that programs can often generate or come up in a bunch of different ways. And so this really asks folks to take a step back and do a lot of work on the back end so that when the program is implemented, that things are just running smoothly. I'm also going to highlight some areas where we really see opportunities for growth in some of the applications that we review, just to kind of help give a lens of when we're reviewing applications, the things that we're looking for specifically within the program design. Really, we're looking for program designs that make everything clear, that help folks that may not be familiar with your community, with your program, easily understand what you're going for, and then also connecting the dots. Sometimes I know it's really hard when you're writing a grant application to step back and think about, what does somebody who has no idea what my organization does think about this kind of thing, but really helping to connect the dots between why your program is important, what your program does, and then what change your program is going to create. Some things that your program design isn't going to do. It isn't going to list every single detail that's important about your program. That would, be a much more comprehensive document than you probably want to submit as a grant application. So the program design is really going to focus on the most necessary core components, and then assume that there are going to be other things that are going to be included in your activity plans and stuff like that. It also is going to be more comprehensive than just describing your program activities. A lot of times when people think about program design, they immediately think of a logic model. A logic model is part of your program design, but that's not the entire thing. We'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. For a program design example, we're going to start by talking about the different pieces in your blueprint. When we think about designing a program, like I said, oftentimes we can jump into that bottom layer, right? The, intervention, what we're actually going to do, what we're going to see. But I really encourage folks to take a step back and ask two questions first. First, what does the community need? A lot of times as service providers or practitioners, we can kind of think like, well, I know that this is a need, or everybody knows that this is important. But really kind of take a look at the need that you're identifying and see how you're going to measure that. So really take a look at your community need and try and find data to back it up. So what statistics show that the need is important, or that the need exists? What kind of data or impact can you find that helps show the importance of your needs? So not just that there's X amount of kids, attending an after school program, but that those kids are 70% more likely to not have, a food secure household or something like that. And then the next step of that, once you have your need identified and you have it measurable, is thinking about what does the world look like if that's not an issue anymore. This sometimes is the same as a long-term outcome, but trying to think about why, what's going to be possible as a result of solving your community need. We'll then kind of go into the nitty-gritty and talk about how we connect those dots, right, from the community need to the vision of what could be possible afterwards. We're going to talk about leveraging resources, how to describe your activities, what your program is going to produce at the end, and then how we're going to create community change. For an operational grant, your program design is going to answer these questions on this slide. And again, we're going to send out the slides, so don't worry about trying to draw this out really quickly. For a planning grant, though, these questions are still really important because these are the kinds of things that you're going to be building up to. So if I was, for example, writing a planning grant, I might look at this and think, okay, what answers do I already know that I can include in my application? What of these don't I know? And what do I think I'm going to need to do to be able to answer this question? So if I am writing a planning grant thinking, I already know my community need, I know what a solution might look like, but I have no idea what interventions I might use. I might build that in as a part of my planning process to say, I'm really going to gather a coalition of stakeholders, that are important in my community need context to help me decide upon an intervention. So that's a little bit how a planning grant might look at this step in the process. Some other themes across all of these different elements, you'll hear me say it a lot, is measurability. So we really want to make sure that the data that we're using to talk about the need, to talk about outcomes, that all of that's measurable. Because, and I am the worst culprit of this, but I love talking about the impact of programs as far as vibes of like, it just had a really good magic, right? And like people were happy, but oftentimes that's not enough to really talk about the impact of the program. So finding ways to really use quantifiable, even if it's so I'll back up. Even if it's not a numeric answer, right? So even if it's a focus group that you're gonna do with your program participants, just making sure that there is something that's more objective than just saying people liked it, right? People had a good time, but really being able to say people were better off at the end, and here's how we know that. So let's dig in a little bit to how you might start answering these questions and what that might look like. When we think specifically about an Americorps program, we have all of those pieces that were on the previous slide, right? The theory of change in the logic model, and all of these different pieces come together as building blocks to build your Americorps program. The foundation that underlies your program, or that Americorps is specifically interested in, is also why do you think your program is going to work, and why is this an Americorps program versus a nonprofit program? So I'm going to talk about all of these three buckets, but just so that you can kind of get a sense of holistically where we're going. These are the three areas that you're going to address in your Americorps application under the program design category. So let's break it down piece by piece. First, we're going to go back to that diagram that you guys saw earlier. So we're thinking about this, Americorps calls this the theory of change of the logic model. we can get, all into the weeds of like how the language, not everybody uses those terms the same way, but this is how Americorps is going to define it. When they say theory of change and logic model, this is the information that they're picturing. The need, so why does your program need to exist? What's the impact of your program? So what better world is your program creating, or what solution is your program creating? And then how are you going to use the resources, activities to create outputs and outcomes that are going to get you to that solution? And we're going to take this step by step, because I know that that's a really big chunk, but just kind of those are the pieces that you're trying to put together. So starting off with need and impact at that high level. Again, these are more more zoomed out than your program design. So we're not talking necessarily about like just where you're planning on doing your program, but your community at large. Why is your program important? Why does it exist? A lot of times we're thinking about questions like who is impacted, what other stakeholders in your community are saying that this is a problem outside of your organization. We're thinking about how this is going to matter in the long run. So maybe if you are doing a program that's focused on literacy, you're going to talk not only about the literacy rates in your elementary school, but also the impact of low literacy. So that's kind of how you can sort of make the need really compelling and help folks that might not have a background in your program area really help to understand, okay, this is important and this is why. We're also going to think about, why it needs to be addressed. A lot of times there's a lot of really good reasons to solve a problem, right? So like I'll use literacy again as an example. If you have a literacy program, you might be thinking, well, we need to improve literacy to improve school readiness. And that's a great reason to address literacy. And that program might look a little bit different than literacy to improve job readiness, or literacy to improve, and maybe your program wants to solve the literacy problem for all of those reasons, but just trying to figure out from your organizational standpoint, from your program standpoint, what's sort of the main impact that you're shooting for. And that, that level of how big your impact is going to be is going to vary from program to program. Some programs are really specific and can say, we want kids to be school ready in 4 grades from, first grade or something like that. Some folks are going to say, we want college students to have unlimited options as far as post-secondary school readiness. So it can really vary, but that's sort of the next step to help somebody understand why meeting your need is so critical. And if folks have questions about that, I'm happy to talk more about that at the end. Really, we're thinking about like, if we fill this gap, what happens? Next, we're going to kind of move down to that second tier, right? So now we're getting more to like, I know why this is important and I know where we're going. And now I'm just trying to figure out like, what are the different wheels we're putting on the bus? Who's sitting in what seat? How do we actually get this going? For inputs and resources, Americorps really likes to think about leveraging and maximizing impact. So you'll hear a lot of Americorps phrases include words like maximizing and promoting and leveraging. And really that's to say, okay, if Americorps comes in as an added resource, what else is made possible that you couldn't have done without Americorps? I like to think about this as like the non-toxic Miracle-Gro for your programs. So thinking about applying Americorps as an enhancement. And how can you, what other inputs is the Miracle-Gro being applied to so that you can have this amazing impact? And then the activities really is that growth, right? So what services is your program providing? Are your Americorps members providing? And how are the beneficiaries being served throughout your program? We're gonna talk about this a little bit more later, but really thinking about getting specific. So when you're describing your interventions and activities, it can be tempting to write a whole long paragraph about, let me tell you all about the amazing things that my members are going to do, and they're going to serve in this school and that school, and that's really great. But really kind of finding a concise way to talk about your activities. We really want to know dosage, duration, and target population are the words that Americorps uses. And all of that means is how often, for how long, and for who. And we're really trying to break that down because that will help us get a way better picture of who's being served, what activities, and what kind of change that is reasonable to expect from that program. The difference between a kid getting tutored for 30 minutes versus 3 hours is huge, right? And so getting a better sense of, for each program, how much of a intervention is being applied, and what kind of change can you then expect from that program? I can also go into a lot of gardening metaphors. I'm trying to stop myself. So if you want more farming analogies, I'm here for it. Okay, so normally if you're planning a program and you've figured out your inputs, what resources you're going to use, you figured out what your activities are going to be, this is where you would start thinking about outputs and outcomes. Americorps kind of gives you a little bit of a leg up by using national performance measures. This is something that Americorps created as a part of a collective data impact system. And really what this is a comprehensive national set of measures that we can use to help align Americorps activities across the country to help then talk about the impact on a larger level. If every single Americorps program had, their own network of outputs and outcomes, it would be really hard to then say, this is what Americorps does, right? Because it would be kind of saying like, well, we have these 6 focus areas and people are doing all sorts of stuff. And so really kind of being able to hammer down and to say, here are a set of different outcomes that we see across the country in a wide range of different programs really helps tell a story of national service in a more meaningful way than we could do if everyone had their own evaluation strategy. And that really, I'll just echo again, the importance of telling the story of national service. So the national service narrative is, Samantha was talking about it earlier when she was describing a little bit about what Americorps is. It's an amazing way to tap your local program into a larger national movement. So really thinking about how do we help connect the dots, right? Not only from a national need, a national desire to then help address something on a local level, but then also going the other way also as well. Thinking about how does your activities locally connect to a larger movement. So there are, 400 programs across the state that are all addressing service needs in Virginia. How do we, help contextualize that story in your community and then also connect you with a larger statewide story? So going back to how you're to do this, you'll open up the national performance measures, which are one of the appendices in the NOFOE and the RFA. And you'll look at your focus area. In theory, you've already picked a focus area, right? Because that was one of the first steps when you were thinking about your Americorps program and thinking about your eligibility, is making sure that you work in an eligible area. You're going to look at the different objectives and interventions associated with that focus area. So I've listed a couple here just as an example. And you're going to make a note of which of these align best with your program. If you have a program that doesn't, for whatever reason, align with any of the interventions, there is a way to select an applicant determined measure, but it is a little more complicated. So I'm not going to go into the weeds, but just know there is some flexibility. So don't freak out if you don't see your intervention listed immediately. But really, this is trying to help coalesce everything under the Americorps strategic plan, which helps us tell the national service narrative. You will read the associated outputs and outcomes that are aligned with the intervention and the focus area that you've selected, and you'll use that to inform your outputs and outcomes in your logic model. And I will kind of say, I think it's on this slide, yeah. So generally, so when you're thinking about your program, right, you've decided what you're going to use, you've decided what you're going to do, and now you're deciding how you're going to show that it worked. That's really all evaluation is, right? Is how do you know something is working or something is changing or something is happening? We're going to take that step by step. Outputs are kind of the immediate, like, something has happened and I can see that it happened because of this, right? And so normally that's counting. Number of individuals served, number of miles or acres maintained, number of units addressed. That's really just purely, it's not talking about quality, it's just talking about quantity, which is important, right? Because it helps us show that, whatever we said we were going to do, that we did it. Outcomes really take that a step further and say, okay, you did what you said you were going to do. Did it have the change that you thought it was going to make? These are normally steps leading up to that larger solution that you had in the first step, thinking about your community need and your solution. So outcomes are building towards that. Sometimes your long-term outcomes are going to be that solution. Sometimes they might not be. We can talk a little bit more about that, but really outcomes are looking at your changes in knowledge, behavior, attitude, condition. So kind of like your longer standing changes than your outputs, right? Or which are just kind of like, yep, we did it. And so outcomes are like, okay, well, how well did you do it? I would generally, some folks look at outcomes and the national performance measures and want to choose a national performance measure for every outcome. And I would generally try and encourage folks away from that, just because it can get really complicated in reporting. What I would recommend folks do when you're looking at your national performance measures is pick one aligned output and outcome per intervention. So if you have a program, and we'll get into an example which might help put some meat on this framework, but if you have a program and you have one intervention, right? So you're only doing one activity, you have a tutoring club, you're only going to choose one output and outcome for from the National Performance Measures instructions for your logic model. You're also going to create 2 other outcomes. So let's say I choose number of students served as my output, and then my outcome is academic readiness. I'm going to choose maybe a short-term and a longer-term outcome and use that as my midterm outcome, or I might use that as my short-term outcome. And then I'm going to create my other 2 outcomes just based on my program activities. This really helps give a little bit more flexibility. So you're not, boxed in, right, to the national performance measures for all of your outcomes. Now, if you're a program that's a little bit more complicated and you have multiple interventions, so like let's say you work with kids and you work with their parents, those are going to be 2 different interventions. So you're going to select 2 different output outcome pairs, if that makes sense. And I can talk more about that if folks are confused. Really, the message here is your outputs and outcomes are going to talk about the quality of the programming that you delivered. So now I'm going to kind of walk through a little bit of an example. So my background is in food security. So I chose a program that I used to run. My community need is identified as a numeric, right, statistic around how many people in Richmond are food insecure. And then my data, if I was doing if this was more comprehensive, would probably also address the disparate rates of diet-related chronic disease that my target population, right, which is food insecure families, demonstrates. I've then cast this vision, right? If families had their needs met, they would be more able to sustain a healthy diet. So those are the 2 things at the top, right? The need and the solution. And then I have below my inputs, right? What are the resources that I'm maximizing? I'm using Americorps members. I'm utilizing partnerships. This would probably also include, I'm using space. I'm using maybe some extra funding from the, local DSS office to help support, healthier food pantry. I've got my 2 activities listed here, nutrition demos and food distribution. And then I have my outcomes listed here on the right-hand side. So thinking about the desired impact, families would immediately have more food. Families would, in the medium term, be able to improve their nutrition education. And then in the long term, families will eat healthier and reduce rates of diet-related chronic disease. The reason why I put this in here is just to kind of help give a sense of what this kind of thing looks like and how it all comes together. This is sort of the traditional program design spiel that I know a lot of folks have heard, but I give it again just to kind of help get folks thinking. If you are creating a program design or if you're using a program design and adapting it, really going through each of these sections and asking yourself these questions, right? And that'll just help get you into a spot where you're filling this out really strategically and can think about, okay, this is more than just an activity that my members are doing. This is really a program that we're implementing together to create community change. So now I'm going to talk about those other 2 buckets. If you remember back to that slide where I talked about the 3 components of an Americorps program design, we've talked about the program design, right? The theory of change in the logic model, what you're actually doing. Now we're going to talk a little bit about how to, I like to think about this as like the cushions of like, how are you going to wrap the program? So you have just cast this beautiful vision. You have a great program and it makes a lot of sense, right? And so now we're going to move towards how do you know it's going to work? This is kind of now you're talking to a funder kind of questions. And so your evidence base is really asking, what evidence do you have or what information do you have that makes your program design like feasible, right? Or potentially possible. So we're looking at evidence on different levels. So we're looking at information with like on a spectrum, you can also think about it that way, to kind of help determine, right, how likely it is that your program is going to work exactly like you said it would. Kind of the gold standard for your evidence base is thinking about using an evidence-based program design. And that is something that's been rigorously tested. Usually there's an academic entity that's done a study on it, or you have, you're using a scholarly article or something like that, really to say, I'm doing this exact program. So like College Advising Corps or Reading Corps or something like that is a great example where there has been a, the word just disappeared out of my head, collection. There's been a set of studies, right, that have been done on the program. And those studies can say, within this amount of reliability, we know that programs that do the model exactly like this are going to have these results. The reason why that's the gold standard is that it really shows us, okay, if I do this, then I'll get out this. And, somebody has studied it and has found that to be true. That often is not the case for a lot of smaller nonprofits or a lot of nonprofits that are thinking about their programming, which is totally fine, right? I would say the majority of our existing Americorps programs are in this silver standard, the second tier, utilizing past program performance data. And really that's kind of saying, okay, you may not have an evidence-based model, right? You may not have an external person that's coming in and saying like, yes, with fidelity, this can produce this result. But you can come in and say, okay, well, we've been doing this for a while and we know from our experience that this is going to work, or right, this is feasible. And so that's really looking at your past program results, your past program data, saying, okay, in last year's participant performance, we know that people that attended this many classes had this kind of outcome. And really that's looking at, that can be from your organization, that can be from another organization. We also want to know how closely your program aligns with the evidence that you're throwing out there. So if you're going to do a healthy cooking program, right? And you say, well, healthy cooking programs have a 90% success rate in getting people to eat healthier. I want to know how closely the activities that you're proposing are going to match up with that data point. So if you're using a program that was designed in Connecticut, are you following their program exactly? Are you taking some ideas from them and then adapting them for your local context? All of that's great, but I just want to know as a reviewer a little bit more about how all of that's coming together. And then kind of the foundational level, the bronze level, is really thinking about what are the other information that helps provide the context for your program. So hypothetically, let's go back to the healthy cooking class example. You have past program performance data, you've done a pilot, you know that it's going to work. You have a similar program in your organization that shows people are going to have this performance based on, a certain attendance rate. Other information might be like a USDA best practices finding or recommendations from your local DOE or DSS or something like that. So other information is a great tool to kind of help provide context, especially if you're making an adaptation. So let's say you're using an existing program model and then you're going to tweak it. Having some other information to inform why you're making that tweak or that adaptation is really helpful just as a reviewer to be able to say, okay, they're making this guess, right, that this program is going to work based on really good info. I could talk about evidence-based all day. If you are thinking about going competitive, just because I know we've got a couple of folks that might, be interested, the CNCS on the federal level assigns an evidence quality metric to kind of help say your evidence, falls into this different, there's different tiers of evidence quality. And so that's the reason why we really talk about this on the formula level. And I won't get too far into like, what's the difference between competitive and formula and whatever, but basically on the statewide level, we want to help support you in making your program more and more evidence-based, not only for Americorps, but also just for your organization. The stronger evidence you have for your programming, the more well-regarded and the more, I guess, the stronger your foundation can be around your program, so that when you're, either taking this program to another community or to another site, you really have a wealth of information to be able to say, we know that this works. And then also Americorps wants to know, why is this an Americorps program, right? So you can have a really great program design and an amazing evidence base, but we really want to know why you think Americorps is like the right intervention or part of the intervention that, is an important element. If you listen to any of the Americorps 101 webinars, you probably heard me say Americorps is not just a grant, it's a program. This is more than just a funding resource, right? We really want to help integrate you as a part of the national service narrative. And so thinking about how is your organization going to host or offer Americorps in a way that is really meaningful and impactful, not only for your program participants, but also for your members. There are 3 questions that you'll see in the NOFO and the RFA that kind of ask a little bit about the member experience. While your members can't be beneficiaries, so your program can't exist solely to serve your members, we really want to make sure that your program, that by participating in your program, that your members are having a really enriching experience. A lot of times we see folks read this section and kind of say, yeah, I'm going to do it. And that's really great. But we also assume that you're going to do it because it's in the grant application. So for this section, really thinking about how, how are you going to do it? How are you going to make it possible in your context? The other thing that I would, just harken back to is for for a planning grant application, both for evidence-based and member experience, think about if those are things that sound scary now, what can you do or what can you build into your planning process to help make more sense, right? So is there a university connection that you want to make or would need help making or something like that to help determine an evidence-based model? Or is there a connection that you need to make in the planning grant period that you think would help develop a richer member experience? These are all kind of things that you can write into your grant to help kind of build the bigger picture and make sure that you get what you need out of the planning grant period. So that is it from me. I know that was a lot of information. If you have questions, please write them down. I would be happy to take them at the end. And I'm going to pass it back to Samantha to talk about organizational capacity.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Annalise. You can see my screen, right? Yes. Okay. So we're going to talk about organizational capacity. Annalise talked a lot about designing your program and the plan and the evidence and developing these outcomes. But what this section is really talking about and what we want to address is, now that you have a plan, how good is that plan if you can't execute it, right? So how are you going to execute your plan? Let's see. So in organizational capacity, we want to know about your background in staffing, your compliance and accountability, a culture that values learning, and member supervision. So I'll get into each of those different sections and kind of lay out a best practice, give a couple of examples, etc. For organizational background staffing, we want to know the roles, the responsibilities, your organizational structure as it pertains to running your Americorps program. One of the items that we do request in the RFA process is an organizational chart, and we'll ask to see whether your positions are full-time, half-time, volunteer, part-time, and this section, when you write it, is going to give you an opportunity to narrate what your positions are at your organization and how they handle each of the roles and responsibilities that you've outlined in your program design. So best practices are in your program design and your theory of change. You've outlined and detailed the activities that your members are going to be doing and what impact those things are going to have. So who in your organization is responsible for making sure that the things happen that you've outlined? We want to see, if you have an executive director, do they have any input into how the program is run, the Americorps program specifically? Do you have a full-time fiscal staff? Are you going to be hiring some staff? A lot of organizations that bring on an Americorps cohort don't necessarily have a dedicated person at that time listed as a program director. And so if you're working with a limited staff, how are your duties going to shift to what, the things that they're already doing to incorporate the Americorps program? If you're going to hire someone to do that, that's great. We want to outline that. So name the positions that you have on staff. It's not enough to just say, we have the capacity to run this program. We want to know, and it's a summary because it's not a huge section or anything, but we want to know how you're going to be doing it. So do you have experience with Americorps in the past? I know a lot of our sub-grantees in our portfolio now speak to having executed federal grants before because they've received funding in the past. If you haven't received Americorps funding, that's fine. Do you have experience running federal grants? Because there's certain, terms and conditions that come along with, safeguarding federal funds. So we just want to know your organizational staffing at that level and any experience that you bring to the table. Compliance and accountability. So this one is always so much fun. So we're asking that, you've outlined your structure and who's responsible for what duties, but we want to make sure that you're monitoring the activities that you outline in your grant. So programmatic activities, fiscal activities, is there oversight of grant and program activities? So do you have a plan to make sure that you, number one, are following your own internal policies? What does that look like? But then also, how are you going to, and what are your expectations? And how do you monitor yourself? Do a simple self audit internally to make sure that you're following Americorps rules and regulations. This is another one where it's Annalise alluded to in member experience, it's not good enough to just say, yes, we will be compliant and yes, we will be accountable. Instead of saying, we will make sure we are compliant, summarize what your plan is. So does your organization monitor grant activities? If you've ever received funding before, how do you safeguard those federal funds? How do you safeguard those private funds? What internal controls are currently in place or will be in place, right? So if you don't necessarily have a policies and procedures manual for, working with your fiscal officer or your fiscal staff, that stuff should probably be in place before we're ready to make sure, ready to give you federal funds to execute an Americorps program. So do you have a reporting structure? Do you have a hierarchy of approvals? During your performance period or as your program activities are being completed, what is your internal timeline for monitoring your own activities and making sure that each piece of what needs to happen does happen and that ultimately it is compliant, right? So what are your internal mechanisms for ensuring that you follow the Americorps policies? Culture that values learning. So we're looking to see that based on the information that you're gathering, Annalise did a great job outlining data, evidence, program outputs, outcomes. So we're looking to see that based on the information that you're collecting, that by observations, right, data collection, plans, conversations, etc., are you identifying how your program is successful or that it needs improvement? And are you using that information to make informed decisions or continuous program improvement? So best practices, showcase how your organization makes decisions based on the data you collect. If Americorps members are serving in X, Y, or Z capacity, how are you utilizing what they're doing and the impact that they're making in the community and with your beneficiaries to therefore determine if the grant activities are making the impact that you've detailed in your application? So are you working with your internal stakeholders, external stakeholders to determine if, what you're doing is making any impact in your community or to your beneficiaries? Member supervision, another section where it's not good enough to just say, we will make sure members are supervised. We're looking for a plan, right, or a structure. Where members and supervisors are trained at some organizational level, there's oversight. So you're clearly describing how Americorps members are receiving guidance and support. You're clearly describing how supervisors are adequately trained and prepared. And then there's evidence that, like I said before, a plan or a structure exists for providing guidance and training to your members and your site supervisors. Some best practices, detail and tell us, summarize how you're disseminating information, right? Is there a continuous feedback loop between administration and the boots on the ground? Your site supervisors and your members who are providing the direct service to your beneficiaries, how is the administration or the hierarchy of your organization interacting with them to make sure that, information is disseminated from top down or however which way your organization does it? Just summarize and detail a plan so we can make sure that there is a direct connection between the policies, the compliance, the supervision, and your members and how they operate in a day-to-day basis. And I will pass it to Shannon to talk about cost effectiveness and budget adequacy.
Thanks, Sam. Do you see my slide? Okay,
Yes,
you're
ma'am.
nodding. I saw that nod. Okay, awesome. Thanks. I'm Shannon. Welcome, everyone. I'm the fiscal officer, and we are going to move into the fiscal side of the Americorps grant making process. And cost effectiveness and budget adequacy is actually the title in the request for applications when it does come out. That will ask for all of the fiscal information related to how you're going to administer your Americorps grant. All right, try to move down to my next slide. So the whole objective of this section in the CNCS Notice of Funding Opportunity is to assess the degree to which your budget is cost effective and it's appropriate for the program that you are proposing. So your budget is your roadmap, obviously. It's the way you're translating what you've thought about in the prior segments of the presentation, your program design, your logic model, what you're trying to achieve, improvements you're trying to make in the community, and how are you going to translate those into the dollars that you need in order to make that happen. So this is just a snapshot, again, of going back to, you're starting at the beginning, and this is translating that into how are you going to implement the goals and objectives of your project. There are a number of resources that are out there currently. You don't have to wait until our until our request for applications is open. These resources are already available for the current year. These links, and they are presentations to from CNCS staff on best practices in budget development, specific application instructions related to creating your budget, defining what the budget categories are, how you would put certain costs into what budget categories, and always the OMB uniform guidance, which is the overall federal grants administration framework, which goes into enormous depth, more than you ever want to know, about grant regulations in terms of fiscal performance and administrative capacity. You can always reference those regulations there at the bottom, the OMB uniform guidance. So you can always move ahead and start checking those items out. So there are three main sections in the Americorps budget. First, the program operating costs, which are the personnel, the staff that are going to actually lead the project and provide member supervision. It's any training for your members or your staff, and it's any travel to make that happen. Travel to training events, travel that may be involved in conducting service, any supplies that you may need to carry out the activities, they would be included in that particular budget category. And then the second portion of your budget are those costs specifically related to your members. It is the living allowance or the stipends that these members will receive every month while they're performing service, the related FICA for those living allowances, any health care, they are eligible for health care if they are working full-time, not working, serving full-time or serving in a full-time capacity, and workers' compensation costs related to those members. So administrative costs, commission support fees. And Sam, I want you to go ahead and give me a verbal affirmative that you can still hear me and that I'm still connected. Hello.
Yes, you're good.
Okay, cool. All right. Things are moving around on my screen. Okay, so administrative costs. You receive 5% of your funds expended as administrative costs for supporting facilities and operations that go into managing your Americorps grant. As part of that, there are commission support fees that are paid from those administrative costs that help us support our operations. And I'll go into a little detail about that further. So what comprises the Americorps budget? There are two sides. There's the CNCS share, which is the federal grantor, and that is your award request. And there's Grantee Share, which is your match. You must provide matching funds for this program, and we'll go over those details as well. And they can be provided in cash or in kind, provided by a third party. So those two pieces together make up your total project costs for your service program. So the Grantee Share, also known as match, and other, your other federal grants or other state, local grants you may receive. There is a schedule of Grantee Share that you provide when you conduct Americorps grants. It begins at 24% and it increases over time if you are to continue receiving Americorps grants each year. After year 3 that you are receiving CNCS funds, that match level increases up to 50% in year 10. You can continue beyond year 10. It's capped at 50%, but here is a schedule of the percentage for your match. So again, your match in your first year would be 24%, and match also applies to our planning grants as well. And again, match can be provided in kind donations, the value of those donations, and any cash contributions that you are making to support your program. In the application, they'll ask you to indicate whether or not your match is proposed and that it's not formally committed as yet, or if it's secured that you've received a definite commitment for those funds. So either either way, it is acceptable to include those in your application. And again, we will ask that you identify and provide sufficient detail in your application related to match. Some folks ask, well, how do I calculate my grantee share? Or in some cases, some folks find it difficult to determine how to calculate, well, how much is my share that I actually have to provide? And here is just an example of a calculation that you can use to sort of back into that number. And so I've provided an example of a planning grant request of $50,000, which would have a beginning grant match requirement of 24%. And you simply take the CNCS share, which is the 76%, and you take that request and divide it by that 76% to determine your total project cost. That total project cost is what is going to be represented in your budget, in your application. We're going to see the whole picture, both sides of the funding in your application. And there's some overall general best practices for creating a strong budget. This is a very, again, basic overview of budget. So obviously, to align the budget with your stated program goals, we would always expect that something that's reflected in the narrative would most often be translated or be reflected in your budget, and vice versa. Something would not show up in your budget that has not been alluded to or referenced in your narrative. There should always be a connection between the two. There are maximum and minimum living allowances for each type of member slot. And they will be listed in the request for applications when it is released. Again, you can go into a lot of the information that's already been released by the feds, and you can see those living allowance levels. But one thing we will look at, and CNCS will look at, is that you are adhering to those minimum and maximum living allowances that members receive. A way to control costs, obviously, is CNCS is willing to contribute so much toward supporting a national service member. And each year they provide a listing of what that maximum is per member service year. There's a calculation to derive member service year. Again, that's more detailed than you need to know right here. But for this year, it will be $16,300. And the budget will work down to create for us that maximum cost so that we can compare it and see that it is compliant, that maximum cost per service year is below $16,300. Of course, we're going to look at your match level, make sure it's the correct match level for the number of years you've been receiving CNCS funds, that you've identified your match sources, that you've included all of the required expenses that we have listed in our request for applications that is necessary to operate the program. Everything from providing gear that your members wear that identify the Americorps program to background checks that you are required to perform for your members and your covered staff. We're always, of course, like any grant reviewer, going to look at your budget and make sure that you have an adequate description of how you have arrived at the numbers you put in your budget, that the calculations that you provide are accurate, and again, that you've provided sufficient explanation and the basis for any costs that you've put in there. And most importantly, we're going to look at whether or not your costs are allowable. We will touch on this in our request for applications, and all of our sources, source information, and the recommended resources that were listed in a few slides prior, they will go into, massive detail about what is allowable, what is not allowable, and so that it should be fairly easy for you to determine whether or not this is something that is allowable to put into your budget. And just a little bit more about the member service year. I mentioned that there is a means to calculate the member service year. Again, those details will be in the request for application. But just so you know, a member service year is not equivalent to the number of members that you are requesting, which are also called slots. And again, it cannot exceed 16,300 from the CNCS side of your budget. This will be calculated when you're at the point you're ready to enter your budget into the portal. It will calculate that for you. So there are a number of means we have to make sure that that's correct. We will also have a budget worksheet tool available when the RFA is released that you can use in Excel to draft up a budget so that you can work up your numbers, move them where you need to, always check your CNCS share to make sure you're within that 16,300 for member service year, and with formulas included. So that is a helpful tool that you'll be able to use. So overall, these are just do's and don'ts, not an exclusive list or exhaustive list. Again, we would want you to itemize each of your costs and make sure you present the basis for any calculations of those costs. Again, make sure you're including the required costs to operate the program, and we will have enormous detail in our RFA about what those are. And if we have that cost that we tell you you need to budget, we will have that listed in there for you. Again, we're mentioning here criminal history checks for any staff that you will be paying for with this grant, and any members, they will need to be budgeted for criminal history checks. Healthcare, again, workers' compensation, we will provide you that cost that we tell you or we instruct you to include in your budget. National service gear, because your members will need gear to when they're out working in the field, in the community, that they are wearing proudly their Americorps logo. Staff and member travel needs to be budgeted for them to attend training. We have a launch or a swearing in of our Americorps members annually, and certainly we would always hope to be able to do that in person. We may do it virtually. Well, let's hope for this particular period we will not. We will be able to do that in person. But any travel costs related to events and training, we want those budgeted as well. And then again, the commission support fee. This is again reminding you to go back to that OMB uniform guidance link that was listed in a few slides earlier. If you want to know about costs to avoid and not to consider in your budget. The link here is a CNCS budget sample on their website, which is a great overview of the level of detail that they are looking for, and therefore we are looking for when we review your budget. And this is just a snapshot of the personnel expense side, how they want to see that information displayed in the application so they can, again, determine the accuracy. They know who the positions are, the titles of the positions, and if there is a share they are providing of that position, what the percentage of that position is. And just in general, things not to include, your budget will just be, it'll be inputted in whole dollars. You will not include any line items that are miscellaneous or contingency that cannot be sufficiently identified. Any unallowable expenses, again, the uniform guidance, one of which is any like food or refreshments or entertainment related costs is just one example that would be unallowable, and unemployment insurance because they are not eligible in Virginia, and that would not be included in your budget. Administrative costs, you would be eligible to receive 5% of funds expended of your CNCS award for administrative costs for overhead for operating your grant. There are 3 different methods listed in the RFA that will instruct you how to select how to calculate that cost. Again, we won't go into that detail, but there will be 3 methods, and it'll be explanatory in the RFA which one applies to your particular organization. And again, this is listed here. The most common method that is used is called a CNCS fixed percentage rate. Again, it's always maxed at 5%. No method will yield a higher administrative cost reimbursed than 5%. It's just sort of how you get there, 3 different methods that they provide. And the budget worksheet tool, that will be an Excel attachment to the RFA, again, is a Excel spreadsheet you can use to calculate your administrative costs. As part of your administrative costs, the 5%, we retain at the Virginia Service Commission 1% of that 5%. So you retain 4%, and we use those funds to support operations of the program. And so overall, I've given you an overview of the budget, some of the basic requirements, things we're looking for. But overall, as Sam mentioned about organizational capacity and reviewing your organization as a whole and its internal controls and protocols that are already in place, we look at the financial capacity that we are assessing of your organization based on the documents you provide with your application to see if you're in a state of readiness to administer an operational grant or a planning grant. There is certain basic infrastructure you need to have in place. So again, we can feel assured that the federal funds would be safeguarded. And so we have at least 2 surveys as part of the application, which will ask a list of questions to sort of gauge your readiness in the financial area. And so we have our final steps. And I believe my colleagues also are going to join me in this. So again, read your application and double check your budget. As Sam alluded to earlier, the most important thing you can do is fully read the request for applications when it is released. It is a lengthy document and there are many attachments. Many of the attachments sort of reiterate what is in the actual request for applications document, but that is your main source for information. Make sure that all your attachments are completed. There are also a number of attachments. Again, this detail will be in the request for applications, and always submit it by the deadline, which is a no-brainer. So.
If you want to go to the next slide, it's just resources. Yeah. Our website has how to apply. The terms and conditions are really a roadmap for what a program should look like. Gives you pretty specific anecdotes about service agreements, timesheets, that kind of stuff. And then the NOFO, which Shannon alluded to, I believe Annalise talked about, I might have talked about, but anyway, it's the Americorps federal notice of funding opportunity. And so we take all of our information, change it a little bit, and use that to release our request for applications. So next slide just is for questions. I'm going to look in the chat box. I mean, we're a pretty small group. I think there's about 10 of us. If you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, we can certainly do that. And whatever staff is on the line, Annalise, Shannon, or otherwise, we can answer any questions. And we're at 4:07, so we definitely have some time if we want to talk about, like I said earlier, when the RFA comes out, which hopefully it'll come out in the next 2 weeks or so, we can't necessarily have these types of in-depth conversations. It'll be more of a formal process through our procurement office. So this is the time to ask those kinds of questions about, well, I have this idea, et cetera, that aren't necessarily RFA specific. You could ask, I guess, specific questions. I don't know if I have the answers, but we'll try to get them to you. So.
I have a question.
Yeah, Marianne.
This is Marianne. I'm in Southwest Virginia for United Way. Something that you said early on in the session, Sam, kind of perked my ears, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about sustainable design. We are a group looking to do a planning grant, and you said something about that it was not necessarily considering sustainability related to your organizational capacity, but more about how we can make the program sustainable long-term for our communities. Can you just speak a little bit more about that?
I think Annalise or Shannon.
I was gonna say, yeah, and I'm happy to hop in for that. So basically, what Samantha was talking about is just that the planning grant process is really specific to your Americorps program, not to your organization. So this isn't a way to fund board development and stuff like that, but it's really specific to, you know, your program design.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and to that kind of question, so if you're thinking about a planning grant, Shannon can also kind of speak to what allowable costs can be figured into that budget. But a lot of times the planning grant budget, Shannon, correct me if I'm wrong, is really staff support focused. So thinking about what staff positions need to be written into that grant to be supported by a student success request. And the cap on that has been in the past 50,000, and it'll be listed in the RFA.
Anything to add, Shannon, before we move from that question? Do you have anything to add to that?
Oh, sorry, I didn't quite hear you. No, that's correct. In most cases, and we are sort of venturing into the planning grant realm. I think they may have done planning grants in the past, but it's been a number of years ago. So we're entering back into that particular area. But again, it's to help you, use resources to plan for the, eventual implementation of an AmeriCorps program. So staff support, training, consultants, again, training and consultants in the areas that would help you develop your logic model, your program design, but AmeriCorps specific types of training and capacity building for AmeriCorps.
AmeriCorps. Okay. Any other questions? Betty, Katie, Tanya, and then volunteer coordinator and DC Brill.
Do we have anyone else on the call that wants to identify themselves? You want to be anonymous?
Don't be shy.
Don't be
We got
shy.
a quiet group today.
Everyone has all the information they need to successfully apply and deploy AmeriCorps members or a planning grant, which is good. That's great. I'm hoping, we get a lot of interest this year.
So I guess now we can just talk about things we want to talk about, but
Baking.
I will kind of mention, I don't think this applies to anybody on the call, but I just wanted to specifically point out that there's the cost per MSY, which is the amount you're allowed to request per MSY in your operational grant application. And then the maximum and minimum living allowances are separate from that. So they're connected in that, like, your maximum minimums aren't going to, your living allowance likely isn't going to be too different than the CNCS request. But just letting you know, if you do have slots that you do have a program where you might need to make the living allowance a little bit higher, that 16,300 is just the amount that you can request, and the actual max per MSY is also going to be listed in the RFA. It's a really confusing way to explain that. But. Any other questions?
Well, if no one has any questions, if all hearts and minds are clear, we will make sure to send this PowerPoint out and put it on our website. And you can contact our office. Any of us will be happy to help. The AmeriCorps info box, I forget what that email is.
It's AmeriCorps info.
AmeriCorps info at dss.virginia.gov.
Perfect, thank you. If you want to send questions there, one of us will be happy to help, or you can contact us directly. Thank you, Christina. I should put it in the chat box for everybody. And I guess that's it. Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Cool, thanks everybody.
Ooh. That's too up close and personal. Let me stop that video right now.
No, I like that. I like your couch.
I'd like to be laying on it right now.
Oh. I removed volunteer coordinator.
Did you remove them, evict them from?
I evicted them. They said they will not be able to rejoin, and I was like, good.
Oh,
Because we don't even know who you are, right?
I don't know who that was. Can you tell, like, if they have any